بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه ثم أما بعد. Thank you for coming, and again we welcome our guests, Dr. Robert Shedinger from Luther College, author of Was Jesus a Muslim? And also we have with us Dr. Zulfiqar Ali Shah, who is presently the Imam of the Islamic Center of Milwaukee. I have to watch my qa and qalqala and ki. Anyhow, welcome back, and we welcome our viewers over the web. And we will continue with our program with Dr. Shedinger, and I would let Dr. Ahmed Afzal introduce him. But before I give him the microphone, just a very brief couple of sentences about Iona and why this program is so important to Iona. As a matter of fact, Iona's mission statement is, Iona is a non-profit, non-violent movement whose aim is to promote and struggle for justice. We believe in the work of social justice, and we believe that after Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the mission is entrusted upon the Muslims primarily after Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to work, to promote and struggle for establishing justice on earth. Now we will take all the help we can get from our Christian brothers, from our Jewish brothers and sisters, from everybody, even atheists for that matter. It may be surprising to you, but even Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam was helped by the mushrikeen, some of the mushrikeen, in his message. Because social justice is an issue that is relevant to all humankind. And there are people who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of the faith issues on an individual basis. But here on earth, we do believe that social justice is a big issue, and it is our responsibility as Muslims to work for social justice. Our slogan is repentance, revitalization of faith, renewal of covenant. With this, I'll give the microphone to Dr. Ahmed Afzal, and he will introduce Dr. Shedinger, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Shedinger here is our next speaker, and Dr. Robert Shedinger, he is associate professor in the Department of Religion at Luther College in Iowa, and he earned his PhD from Temple University. His specialization is in the study of the Bible. However, today he is going to tell us something more than just the study of the Bible. Dr. Shedinger's book that caught my attention and the attention of others in Iona, and which has caused us to invite him, is titled Was Jesus a Muslim? And I will let Dr. Shedinger take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm pleased to be here this evening, and also have been participating in the morning program. And I'm greatly humbled to be invited to share with you and to talk about the ideas that and the journey that led me to write a book with a title like Was Jesus a Muslim? So what I'd like to do this evening is to share that journey with you, share with you my personal and intellectual journey that led to the writing of this book. And that will necessitate talking about some academic ideas along the way, but I will try to talk about them in terms of my own emerging awareness of certain issues. And so this will not be just an academic lecture, but I will try to share it, present it as sharing my own development over the last 8 or 9 years. So, as you know, I wrote a book with the title, Was Jesus a Muslim? Now, in my community, in the Christian community, that is a very, very provocative title for a book. So much so that my publisher, which is associated with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, did not want to put that title on the cover of the book, and I had to really push for that title, for the book to be titled that way, because this is a very controversial thing to say. To most Christians, you say, was Jesus a Muslim? Well, the answer is obviously no, because Jesus lived in the 1st century and Muhammad didn't come until the 7th century with the development of Islam, so Jesus chronologically could not possibly have been a Muslim. And yet I've come to the conclusion that the answer to that question is actually yes, in a certain sense. And so I would like to share with you how I got to, first of all, ask that question and then answer it in an affirmative way. As the introduction said, I did my graduate study at Temple University in Philadelphia, and I started there in 1995. And I went there out of seminary after 3 years in seminary because I was really interested in the study of the Bible. And I still very much am, and I teach a lot of courses in biblical studies at Luther College. But I went there primarily because I was interested in the Bible, and I had no interest in studying Islam when I went to Temple. So I went about my business and was studying my courses in biblical studies. And my advisor one day in a meeting suggested to me that it wouldn't be a bad idea for me to take one doctoral seminar in Islam, a basic introduction to Islam, because with that I would be able to market myself on the job market as being able to teach an introductory level course to undergraduates on Islam, along with my specialty in biblical studies. And because the academic job market was very, and continues to be very, very tight and very competitive, that would give me a leg up on the competition. So I followed his advice and I took a seminar in Islam, and that's the only reason that I took it. But I became very interested in Islam through that course, so I took a second one on the academic study of the Quran, both of these taught by Mahmoud Ayub, who was just a wonderful teacher and a wonderful person, and I came to really appreciate him, and I really became interested in Islam in a way that I hadn't really expected to through those two courses. So I graduated, got my PhD, primarily in biblical studies, got hired at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa in 2000. In the fall of 2000, I went to Luther and began teaching. So I taught an introductory course in Islam in the spring of 2001 for the first time. Now, in that course, there was a young woman from Morocco, and she was the only Muslim in the course. We have some Muslim students at Luther, but not a lot. And so she was in the course, and she was very, very well educated in her tradition, so much so that I didn't know why she was even in the course. I didn't know what she could learn from me. She certainly knew more about Islam than I did, as a Muslim herself. But she made many useful contributions to the class, and then towards the end of the semester, she came by my office one day, and she said, "Dr. Shedinger, I would like to talk to you about the class." And I said, "Sure, come on in." And so we talked, and she told me things like she thought the class was wonderful, and she was really enjoying it, and she never thought that she would be able to take a course in her tradition when she came here from Morocco, coming to a college of the church in Iowa, that she didn't think that would be available. So she thought it was wonderful that I was teaching a course on Islam. So I was feeling pretty good at that point about her comments, but then she said, "But there's one other thing. All of the information you're presenting about Islam, the names and the dates and the people, all that is correct as far as I know, but there's something about the way you're presenting Islam that doesn't feel right to me as a Muslim, but I don't understand exactly what it is," just the feeling that she had. So I thanked her for being very frank and invited her to come back and talk to me about this at any time if she felt the need to. But when she left my office, I only thought about it for a little bit, and then I sort of put it aside because she didn't know exactly what the problem was, and so I didn't know what to do about it, so I just kind of put it aside. Life went on through the summer of 2001, and then in September of 2001, I came back to school, ready to start teaching my courses in biblical studies again. I wouldn't be teaching Islam until the spring. And then, of course, September 11th happened, and everything changed for me, because suddenly everybody was interested in knowing more about Islam after the events of 9/11, And people in the Northeast Iowa community heard that there was a so-called expert on Islam teaching there, and so everybody wanted me to come and talk about Islam and educate them. So I did this because I knew it was important in the aftermath of 9/11 to try to dispel harmful stereotypes and all that. But I did it with this constant feeling of, what am I really doing here? I'm being made to be a spokesperson for Islam when I know that the only Muslim student who's ever sat through my class on Islam didn't feel that I was presenting Islam in the correct way. And so what do I do about that? So it made me very uncomfortable, but I went to many of these events. And then Huda signed on to be a student worker in our department. So I got to know her better and got to see her on a regular basis. And over the next 2 years, until she graduated in 2003, we worked together very, very closely. And she took the initiative and she founded a Muslim student association at Luther College. And we began doing more events together to educate people about Islam, and we worked together to bring in some Islamic scholars to speak at Luther. And through all that and through our own interactions with one another, we gradually were able to give voice to her concern about the way I had taught that course on Islam in the spring of 2001. And what she challenged me to do, really, over the last 8 years was to completely rethink, at a very fundamental level, my whole understanding of my own tradition, Christianity, and about religion in general. So I would like to try to walk you through that process a little bit. In what way did she challenge me, and how did I have to rethink my own tradition and religion in general, and what's the implication of that for how Christians and Muslims might be able to work together in the world for justice? Basically, what Huda challenged me to do was to consider what, for me, was the radical notion that Islam was not a religion. And I said to myself, but what do you mean Islam is not a religion? There are hundreds of world religion textbooks on the market that have chapters about Islam in them. Islam courses are taught in religion departments at colleges and universities all over North America and Europe. What do you mean Islam is not a religion? This was a radical idea for me. But I've come to the understanding that Huda was right. Huda knew more about this than I did. She was a student, I was a professor, but she knew more about this than I did. She was right. But what did she really mean when she said that Islam is not a religion? I had to go back and begin thinking about my entire doctoral training in the comparative study of religion, and I had to rethink all of it. So here's how some of that rethinking went. I came to recognize that we talk about religion, the generic concept religion, in a very specific way in the Western world. We talk about religion as if it's a thing that exists in the world that can be defined and distinguished from things that are not religion. And the things that are not religion are usually considered politics and economics and science. And so we have a very specific way in which we talk about religion. But of course, religion itself is an abstract term. You can't go out on the street and sort of see religion, but what you meet are specific types of religions. So we tend to put names to them like Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Taoism and Confucianism, and there may be a whole variety of others that people would list. But we talk about all of these traditions as if they're types of the same thing. They're all types of religion, and therefore we can compare them to one another, find out what they have in common, where the differences are, so that we can learn more about them. But that becomes really problematic because scholars try to define religion by looking at what all of the different religions have in common. Whatever they have in common must be a feature of that generic concept religion. Well, that sounds fine, and many scholars have tried to do that, comparing all the different religions to see what they have in common so that we can come up with a definition of religion in the generic form. But that's really problematic, because how do we know what the list of religions is if we don't first have a definition that would allow us to determine what things count as religion and what things don't? So the whole process ends up being backwards. And so I had to get my mind around that the whole concept of comparative religion that I had been educated in is actually quite problematic. It's a specific way of thinking about the world that most people throughout most of history didn't think that way. It's a specifically Western, and I would even say Christian, understanding of the world. Well, as I began to probe even deeper, I realized there are other problems with this concept religion and with the whole enterprise of comparative religion. It wasn't just that there were problems with the category itself, but there were ethical issues here as well. And I came upon a very influential book, very influential for me, by an author named David Chichester, who wrote a book in the mid-90s about how comparative religion scholars from Europe operated when Europeans went into southern Africa in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries during the colonial period. What happened was comparative religion scholars went into southern Africa and they started looking at the indigenous population of southern Africa, and they wanted to find out what kind of religion those people had, because they assumed that all people throughout the world had some type of religion. So they looked at the cultural beliefs and practices of the African people, and they couldn't find anything that seemed to look to them like religion. And so they came to the conclusion that Africans didn't have religion. But they also believed that religion was a defining feature of humanity. And so it stood to reason, if the Africans did not have religion, religion is a defining feature of humanity, then the Africans must not be really fully human. And then that authorized the colonial oppression of people in southern Africa by Europeans. Now, what happened was, over time, once they got control of the population, they suddenly discovered that the people did have some type of primitive religion. But then when rebellions would break out and they didn't have control of the population, they would then suddenly come to the conclusion that they didn't have religion. They would deny them having religion, which then authorized reasserting control over people that were not considered completely human. So I began to see that the whole concept of comparative religion had a whole host of ethical problems and issues as well. And then I began to discover that same kind of analysis coming out of the work of some Islamic scholars. So I began reading more Islamic scholars, and I began seeing this theme emerge over and over again. And I would just like to give you a couple of examples. When I was in college as an undergraduate in the late 70s, and around 1979 is when the Islamic Revolution in Iran took place. And so there were a lot of Iranian students at Temple that I knew, but then suddenly Iran was considered, the bastion of evil here in the West, and the Ayatollah Khomeini was the very face of evil for many Americans after that event. Well, I went back and I started reading some of the writings of Ayatollah Khomeini, and what I discovered was he wasn't really this, face of evil that I was taught to believe in 1979. He was actually a very insightful and thoughtful scholar who had a lot of interesting things to say. So I began reading his works, and I began finding this theme in his works where he would say, in the period before the revolution, during the oppressive rule of the Shah of Iran, who was backed by Western powers, that Western-trained religion scholars would come into Iran and they would say to the Muslims, they would teach the Muslims that Islam was a religion. And by that they meant Islam was a spiritual tradition. It was primarily about a person's relationship with God, and therefore it didn't have any real implications for the horizontal level of life, for relationships among people. And what Khomeini was arguing is that by getting the Muslims in Iran to understand Islam as a religion, they were taking away from them the motivation to resist the oppression that they were experiencing from the Western-backed rule of the Shah. Because if they could understand Islam as just a spiritual tradition, then it had no implications for the larger political and economic situation of life in Iran. And he strenuously argues against that, saying Islam is not a religion, it's a movement for the creation of social justice, and as such has inherent political and economic dimensions to it. So I thought that was very interesting. And then I found the same argument coming from a very different perspective from another Islamic scholar, Fareed Isaak. Isaak is a South African scholar, and he spoke at Luther a few years ago, and I got to meet him and speak with him. But he grew up in South Africa under the oppressive apartheid, racial apartheid system. And he's a black South African, so he was on the wrong side of apartheid. And he argues that during the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, government officials would often come to the Muslim community and they would say to them things like, there's no need for you to engage in anti-apartheid politics because you have complete freedom of religion. You can pray, you can fast during Ramadan, you can build mosques and religious schools, you can give the call to prayer, you can practice the 5 pillars, you can do all of these things that make up the religion of Islam. And because you have complete freedom of religion, there's no need for you to engage in anti-apartheid politics. And of course, what Isaak understood from someone living on the side of the oppressive system is that what was really being said is, just be good practicing Muslims and don't bother us, and everything will be fine. But Isaak, like Khomeini, understands Islam as a movement towards social justice. And so by calling Islam religion, it disempowers Muslims from engaging in that struggle for justice. So I began to see this theme coming out in all different places, from David Chidester's work on comparative religion in Southern Africa, to the Ayatollah Khomeini, to Fareed Isaak, and it really began to dawn on me that this concept religion is actually a very, very problematic one. And not only is it problematic to call Islam a religion, but I began to recognize that it's very problematic for Christians to understand Christianity as a religion as well. Now, what I had to do was to try to get my mind inside what I call the Islamic conceptual world. If I was going to accept the idea that Huda was trying to get me to see, that Islam was not a religion, then I had to ask the question, well, what is Islam if it's not a religion? And what does it mean to say that it's not a religion? So I began to read more Islamic scholars and try to get my mind inside the conceptual world of Islam. And what I discovered is that Muslim sources are not based around a notion that is very, very common in the Western world. In the Western world, we think of reality as being made up of 2 different parts, the sacred world and the profane or the secular world. And that comes out in things like the separation of church and state or the separation of religion and politics. The sacred realm is the realm of religion. The secular realm is the realm of politics and economics and other social structures and institutions, and these 2 must be kept separate. But when I got my mind inside the Islamic conceptual world, I recognized that Muslims don't think that way, that the world is not made up of 2 separate realms, everything is one. I was introduced to the concept of Tawheed, unity. Now, all the textbooks on comparative religion talk about Tawheed as being a basic concept at the center of Islamic thinking, but they all say it means monotheism, the unity of God, and that's as far as they go. But what I recognize by reading other Muslim scholars is that Tawheed goes beyond simply the theological assertion of the unity of God, that it has other dimensions as well. The unity of God implies the unity of all humanity, and it implies the unity and integrity of all lived experience, such that it's impossible to conceive, when one's thinking from the perspective of Tawheed, it's impossible to conceive of a sacred and a secular realm. Everything is bound up together as one. And if that's the case, that has profound implications for how we think about the world, because if everything is bound up in one, then we can't have spiritual teachings that are separate from political or economic teachings. Economic teachings become spiritual teachings become economic teachings. Everything is enfolded and wrapped up together in this concept of unity. Well, as I began looking around, I recognized that that's not just a worldview that Muslims share, but it's actually the way most people throughout history in most parts of the world have conceived of the world. The sacred-profane dualism that's so common here in America and Europe is a fairly modern aberration. It's sort of a movement away from the norm. Most people throughout history have not thought in that way. So I began to recognize that Tawheed had tremendous implications for how one thought about the concept religion. You can't talk about religion as just being about the sacred. Tawheed implies that this divine unity is involved in all affairs of life, including the structural affairs of life, not just one's individual life, but the structures of communal life as well, political and economic structures. I would just like to share with you one quote from Tariq Ramadan, who I think puts it very well, an Islamic scholar who's been very influential in my thinking. And he writes, "The social message of Islam is born in all people's consciousness of their obligations to make it possible on the collective level to organize structurally the protection of the rights of all." And I want to underline that structurally. He says, "The social message of Islam is born in all people's consciousness of their obligations to make it possible on the collective level to organize structurally the protection of the rights of all." And what are those rights? The right to life and the minimum necessary to sustain it, the right to family, to housing, to education, to work, to justice, and to solidarity. And when I read that, I say, all right, if I go with Ramadan here and many other scholars, Islam is not a religion, it's a social justice movement. And that's the conclusion that I came to. And social justice movements are, by their very nature, have inherent political and economic dimensions to them, because you can't have social justice without economic justice. And so this was a real revelation to me. And I thought, well, what am I going to do with that? Now I sort of understand, I think, how Muslims view the world, and it's very different from how Western Christians view the world. But what's the next step? What does anything of this have to do with Jesus? The book is entitled, "Was Jesus a Muslim?" So what does this have to do with Jesus? Well, as I continued to investigate, I recognized that the sacred secular dualism that's so common in the West, it's not only something that was not part of Muslim thinking, but it was foreign to anybody who lived in the ancient world. Well, guess what? Jesus lived in the ancient world, first century Palestine, under the oppressive rule of the Roman Empire. If there was no functional category in the first century, then nobody in the first century could possibly have thought of Jesus as a religious figure. Now, that's really going over the edge for many Christians to suggest that Jesus wouldn't be considered a religious figure, but I'm really convinced that nobody in the first century would have said, yes, Jesus is a religious figure, because they had no concept of a separate category called religion. They thought in the way Muslims think, in this concept of unity. All of life was integrated together. Well, there's been a lot of scholarship over the last 15 years or so that's been trying to understand Jesus outside of the bounds of this concept of religion. It used to be, and when I was growing up, when I went to seminary, that the Roman Empire was always thought of as sort of being a backdrop against which Jesus lived out his spiritual message of salvation of human beings. And the Romans were just sort of there as kind of a painting on the wall, but they weren't really involved in what was going on. But that has changed dramatically in scholarship in the last 15 years, I would say, in which more and more scholars are recognizing that the Roman imperial system influenced every aspect of people's lives in that society, every aspect that you can possibly think of. The Roman imperial system was very, very oppressive of the Jewish population of Palestine. through the use of the temple, which was a way to extract wealth from the people and send it back to the imperial center. And so more and more scholars are beginning to recognize that Jesus must be understood in light of the realities of Roman imperial domination and oppression of the Jewish people. And that Jesus, as not being a religious figure, but much more of a political figure who is involved in leading a movement of resistance against the injustices being foisted upon them by the Roman imperial authorities. And there's all kinds of ways that we can read the gospel accounts to sort of recover that political aspect of Jesus that has been lost throughout most of Christian tradition, where Jesus has been turned into a theological idea, a spiritual savior of people's sins, and has been completely depoliticized. One of the ways is just the title Messiah. Christians tend to think of that as a purely spiritual title, but in the first century, Messiah was a political title. The Messiah was a Jewish idea of somebody who was going to come back and destroy the Roman Empire and lead to the destruction of the Roman Empire and lead to the recreation of the ancient Israelite empire. So for anybody in the first century to be running around and calling Jesus the Messiah would have sounded to Roman ears like an act of treason. And so it's no wonder that someone like Jesus, if that's what was going on, would be executed by Roman imperial officials. So there's all kinds of evidence to suggest that Jesus was a very political figure in the first century, leading a movement of resistance against the injustices of the Roman Empire. Not a religious figure who was just going about trying to save people's sins and say that I'm the third person of the Trinity and all of that. That just was not happening in the first century. Jesus was a highly political figure. He was a prophet of social justice, historically. And so if that's the case, then I had to draw the conclusion that Jesus saw the world much more consistent with the way Muslims understand the world than the way Christians generally understand the world and understand Jesus. And so I had to come to the conclusion that yes, in that sense, Jesus was in fact a Muslim. And so again, this, as I said, this was a real revelation for me. But it sent me back to think about my own Christian tradition. Why is it that we have totally lost in the Christian tradition any understanding of Jesus as a prophet of social justice? And why have we turned Jesus completely into a theological idea? Well, that movement is very complicated and not one that we can get into this evening. But what I discovered is that the voice of the political Jesus is not completely missing from the Christian tradition. It's there. It's not the dominant voice. It hasn't been the dominant voice, but it's there in the tradition. And let me just give you a few examples. In the 1960s and 1970s, a movement developed in South America, in primarily Brazil, but in some other places too, in South America, known as liberation theology. And this was a particular theological movement coming out of the Roman Catholic Church in South America that began to think about the relevance of Jesus for the material aspects of people's lives. People were living in societies characterized by high levels of economic injustice. And some scholars began to say that we can't think of Jesus as just this spiritual savior of people from their sins so that they go to heaven when they die, because people are hurting materially in our societies. And if Jesus has no relevance for those justice issues, those economic justice issues, then really what good is Jesus at all? And so a movement called liberation theology developed around this idea that Jesus was a prophet of justice and that Christians should be engaged in the struggle against injustice in the world. That idea was then shortly later picked up in America during the civil rights struggle of the late 1960s and 1970s by African American theologians who began developing what has come to be known as black theology. And one of the great theologians of that tradition, James Cone, has just said flat out, any tradition that does not understand Jesus as the liberator of the oppressed is heretical. Okay, Jesus was the liberator of the oppressed. What you see happening here is the voices of the political Jesus come from people who have the experience of living under oppression. The people in South America who are suffering under high levels of economic injustice. African Americans in this country living in systems of racial injustice. Those are the people that began to say, hey, wait a minute, Jesus has relevance for the material realities of life, not just for the spiritual. And they began to develop theologies, Christian theologies, around a much more political reading of Jesus. There was also the social gospel movement that developed in America in the early 20th century, around the turn of the 19th, 20th century, by a man named Walter Rauschenbusch, who was a Baptist pastor in New York City. And living in a time when, again, American society, not unlike today, was characterized by high levels of wealth disparity. A few people who are very, very rich, and a lot of people who were really, really struggling. And I don't have to tell those of you living in the Detroit area how much people are struggling economically today with extremely high levels of unemployment, while people on Wall Street are making millions and billions of dollars with all of their fancy schemes of derivatives and all that kind of stuff. So life in America was apparently very much like that 100 years ago, and so Walter Rauschenbusch, this Baptist pastor, seeing his own parishioners in his church suffering in tremendous ways because of the economic and social injustice that characterized America at that time, began arguing that what good is a Jesus who's just going to save us from our sins so that we can go to heaven when we die if Jesus is not relevant for these issues of social and economic injustice in our society? And he began to articulate a very political reading of Jesus. So through liberation theology, black theology, the social gospel movement, all of these traditions have, within the Christian tradition, have recovered this political reading of Jesus, but they haven't become the dominant voice. And the reason for that is, as soon as anybody in our society, in Western society, begins to articulate a Jesus who is a more political figure, who is interested in the struggle for justice, people begin to say, oh, no, that you can't do that. That's using or abusing religion for political ends, and you can't mix religion and politics. That's that dualistic structure that comes in. No, you can't mix those two. That's not appropriate. But Jesus didn't live in a society that recognized a sacred, profane dichotomy. He lived in a society where everything was unified and where spiritual and material realities were all bound up together. And in the same way, I would argue that the Islamic tradition and the Islamic sources also articulate a view of reality that is based around this concept of unity. So I think where this leads me then is to suggest that if it's possible, and this won't be easy, but if it's possible for Christians to recover these voices of the political Jesus from liberation theology, black theology, social gospel, and some other movements, if those voices can become more dominant and Christians can begin to rethink their understanding of the purpose and work of Jesus in the way that I have been challenged to rethink it over these last 9 years, then Jesus, I think, can become a center around which Christians and Muslims can work together to engage in the struggle for a more just and humane world. At least I hope that can happen. It won't be easy. It won't be easy for two reasons. One is, it won't be easy for Christians to be able to engage in that process of rethinking the purpose and work of Jesus, because the old theological categories are so deeply embedded in the way many Christians think. So that won't be easy, but I don't know that it's impossible. It also won't be easy for Muslims, particularly here in the West, to resist the dominant discourse of the West that wants to construct Islam as a religion, as a primarily spiritual tradition. So there's powers and forces out there that want to disempower the Islamic movement and not say it's a social justice movement, to put it in the category of religion so that it doesn't have anything to say to the material realities of life, that's, I think that's going to be very difficult, just as it's going to be very difficult for Christians who accept that system to rethink it and say, hey, wait a minute, Jesus does have relevance for the material realities of life, for the structural realities of life, politics and economics. So it won't be easy, but I do think that there's a way forward here for Christians and Muslims to work together for social justice. And that's what this whole process has led me to conclude. And I think it's very important to emphasize that, again, I did not come to this idea necessarily willingly. I was almost led to it, almost kicking and screaming in some ways, because I had to give up things that I so firmly shaped my whole worldview, and that was not easy to do. And I didn't come to it purely as an academic exercise, although there was an academic component to it. I came to it because of my relationship with Muslim students at Luther College. It was because Huda came to my office one day and said, how you're presenting Islam in that class just doesn't feel right to me as a Muslim. And it's because other Muslim students that I've had in class since then that I've come to know, who have come to me and said, you really seem to get it. You really seem to understand how we think. And so many other people in society don't. And it wasn't always the way for me. But Muslim students have helped me along that journey. And so it's in the interaction between me as a Christian and my students as Muslims that this idea has emerged and dawned on me that in some sense, yes, Jesus really was a Muslim, and that has profound implications for how we interact together as we work together for a more just world. If it hadn't been for those relationships, this journey for me never would have happened. And so that tells me that wonderful things can come out of relationships building between Christians and Muslims in our communities. And so I hope, I really have been impressed with what I've learned about Iona just in the short time that I've been here and the work that this organization is doing. And I applaud it and I support it, and I encourage you to continue to move forward and for us to continue to move forward together. Justice is what is at issue here, and we are the ones who have the ability to bring it about. Thank you for listening.